So I'm going to kick off with the easy material, and then when it gets tricky, I'm going to pass it over to Yael. So I want to kind of set the scene for you a little bit. I believe there were some discussions earlier on about this idea of ensembles of models. So one of the canonical cases that are in our literature, so Yael and I are decision analysts, and one of the canonical cases we use when we think about this idea of aggregating multiple forecasts is economic forecasting. So this is a case where we're looking at a particular economic quantity in one country, and you're seeing the box plots here are showing you the range of different forecasts that a panel of economists are coming up with. So these different economists, a lot of the time are using models, but they're also kind of combining their knowledge of when these different models work well, when they don't, what sort of economies they can, economic changes they can pick up. And as you see, there's a fair disagreement in some cases. But we're also seeing the red dots here. We're also seeing what were the realizations. How good was this community of economists at actually forming a forecast? So we have cases where there's a high variation between the experts. But then we have other situations where the experts are all agreeing fairly heavily. But then we also have cases where the experts are all agreeing fairly heavily. They also got it right. They span their different forecasts, span the actual value that it turned out to be. So we call that bracketing. So they're bracketing on either side of the realization. And then there are situations where the entire panel of experts completely miss. So you can see, if you think about this, economic modeling is a kind of an older science. It's been around for a while. They have some good models, but it's very hard to predict. And when there are these sort of rapid changes, you get situations where they just flat out miss every single one. So we want to think about this from the point of view of how would you try and use the information that these multiple forecasts are providing to come up with a reasonable forecast, a fairly robust forecast of the quantity we're trying to predict. So what's my closest link that I have to your community? So for about 20 years, I've been doing oil-spill risk analysis up and down the West Coast. So in these situations, we are using petabytes of traffic data and weather data. We're building these big simulation models that replicate exactly what goes on in a particular port or waterway. But we've got to overlay on that information about, well, what is the risk of all these different situations that you see? So we have a few accidents and a few hundred sort of triggering incidents that have happened. Obviously not enough data to really model in a particular system. So we have to add a layer, kind of a connecting layer of expert knowledge. So we have to formally use expert knowledge and add that into the model to come up with our forecasts, our risk forecasts. And we do this both to predict the current level of risk, so what situations are they not seen, where are the hotspots essentially for potential accidents and incidents that could lead to oil spills. But we also are looking at, for environmental impact statement type analysis for new construction, we're looking at, well, what might happen going into the future and what interventions do we need to mitigate the increasing risk as new projects come online, more traffic gets added to the system. And in this case, again, we end up with multiple models, or at least we end up with multiple experts, and we're still getting this idea of what is the underlying uncertainty. Sometimes it's uncertainty because there's a minimal amount of data. Sometimes it's uncertainty because I've got a group of experts and no actual data on that particular parameter, and there's a lot of disagreement between those experts. So again, sort of high uncertainty. So how would we approach aggregating these forecasts? What are the basic methods that we use? So I'm a geek, so I'm going to introduce some notation. So you've got these different forecasts. The small f's are going to be the forecast. We've got key different experts. So I might get a group of 15 to 20 mariners to come in and fill out our questionnaires that allow us to estimate risk. So we have forecasts on a number of different quantities. So we have a history of how well they've done going back in time. So they give the previous forecasts, and we have the realizations, so as you saw in the economic forecasting. And then they're all giving these different forecasts of the same quantity. So how would you actually aggregate this? Well, the embarrassing thing for our literature for a long time has been that there's a very good way to aggregate these. It turns out to be robust and work pretty well in most of the cases that we run into. And that's a simple average. So equal weighting turns out to be reasonably good. And so people have published a lot of theoretical papers like, oh, clearly we can do better than this by building more robust theory. So one of those would be to let's weight the experts based on how skillful they are, how accurate they are. So we consider their forecast errors going back in history. So how far off were they in each of the previous periods that we have history of? And then you can estimate the variance of their forecast errors. And you can actually, if you assume normality of the forecast errors, you can show that the mean squared error loss is achieved with this forecast, where you're weighting the experts based on the inverse of their variances. So that's the relative weight that they're each getting. So if you're abating, the term precision for 1 over the variance. So this allows you to start including skill. And so a more skillful, a better expert with better history is going to receive more weight. An expert who's missed more often, but further away from the truth, will receive a lower skill. But one of the things that a lot of people leave out of this is that the experts often are using overlapping information. So if a number of you each forecasting the same quantity, you have your sort of competing models that you're publishing in the literature, you're often using the same underlying data sets. So you're training the models on the same data set. So while they have differences, they also have a lot of underlying overlap in the information that's driving it. So if you have this sort of situation, you can actually estimate the correlation between the forecast errors. There are two models tend to always go high and go low at the same time. Or do we tend to, I go high, you go low, so you can actually have a negative correlation. So you can estimate the correlations, and then you assume, well, it's a very normal model, and you can form another type of aggregation. And this is going back to Bates and Granger, who do the 2-expert version of this, and Bob Winkler of Duke, who most knows very well, who did an N-expert case. So you end up basically saying, we're going to weight everybody sort of by how good they are. So if I have a low variance, they'll receive more weight. But if two of us are overlapping, we've got to discount both of our weights a bit. Because if we're both doing well on the same data, and we're saying the same thing, you're not learning as much from the two of us. Me and my friend did it, pretending to have. So you end up with a weighted average using that 1 over the variance, so it's similar to the variance-based weights, but now we're taking discounting for the covariances between the experts. Anybody notice an issue with this model? How many parameters do we have now? Lots, yeah? So we're really kind of exploding in the number of parameters, and each of those parameters needs to be estimated. And it really is going to depend on what sort of environment you have as to how much historical data you have to be able to estimate. How many previous forecasts and realizations are you going to have? So how would we measure how well one of these methods is doing? What's the typical forecasting error measurements? You could use the mean absolute percentage error, which is very commonly used because it's kind of robust outliers. You can use the mean squared error. You can use the, anybody Japanese in the audience? I think it's the Aggregating, anyway, it's AIC, which is going to penalize any one of the methods. It uses a lot of parameters to penalize it for overfitting with those extra parameters. After these methods came out, the fairly sort of standard sort of theory that we all talk about with those 3 methods, that there are a lot of competing methods. If you actually think about the Winkler type weights and the variance type weights, those are essentially similar to regression weights, but with constraints on the parameters, because the weights will have to sum to 1. And so people have come out with other approaches, kind of similar kind of ideas around lasso, clustering ideas, PCA type ideas, none of which have done great unless you have a lot of data to fuel those methods. You also have situations where you might say, I want to choose between different methods using the AIC. So which one is overall fitting better, which one's using more parameters, and then choose a method. Again, it does fairly well. One of the the methods that work great is top 5. So by top 5, you basically look at, you rank all of your experts on their mean, their historical mean. And the top 5, you equally weight them. So you're just trying to find out which of the top 5 that do, well, why 5? Well, they just kind of popped it out of a paper, Manus and Rick Larrick and Jack Stoll. But it's really good. Just picking the top 5 and then giving them equal weights is a really robust, very simple way to come up with a good aggregation. So my PhD student, Dave Soul, who was a former executive at Capital One, came back to do a PhD, and then he's heading off to teach at the University of Richmond now that he's turning 60. The oldest PhD student I just got to put him on Saturday. He's always had a lot of interest in, well, what are these sort of heuristically good methods, which one's going to work well? So in his dissertation, he actually force-traced these. In his literature review, he kind of took a look in the literature of kind of who had done any empirical work to find out which methods work well. So it really depends on the sample size. So as you go up here, you're getting more sample size. For most of the sample sizes we deal with, so the economic forecasting, when I'm looking at my oil spill risk forecasting, relatively low sample sizes. And in those cases, you see the SA beats the variance and the variance beats the covariance method. And the basic reason for that, it turns out, people have gone into all the math behind it. You're estimating too many parameters, the noise in the estimates ends up washing out the theoretical improvements. So you end up with small sample sizes, you may as well just use a simple average. And then as you start increasing the sample size, you might get to a point where you have enough data to estimate variances. And those start to be okay. And then you might get to a point where we have a lot of information, more than kind of not big data, but medium data sort of situations, where we find you have enough data for the covariance methods to work well. But it does take a lot of data. It takes, a lot of people say you need at least 30 data points to estimate a mean, but you need at least about 400 is kind of a common statistical heuristic for estimating correlation. Then my student took these 2 different data sets. He got a big data set of economic data from Focus Economics, and he got some experimental data from Almanis and his co-authors. And he really wanted to see, well, which one of these sort of other methods, how would they do compared to the simple average? So you can see the sort of historical sample sizes we're dealing with here. You can have situations where you have as low as 4 historical points, and you're trying to estimate these parameters from that. And then you're getting up to a case of 20 historical data points. Well, AIC, I didn't bother putting them on the slide, because basically these low numbers of data points, it's just always choosing the simple average. So it just doesn't really beat the simple average, because it's just doing the same thing. It's just defaulting back to that. Top 5, though, is fairly consistently beating the flip of a coin in the 2 data sets. And it actually does a little bit better with the experimental data, but it still does really quite well with the economic data. So just choosing the top 5 based on their historical performance and taking a simple average, it's a really robust technique. So what I want you to take away from this first bit here, when you don't have a lot of data, don't try to overdo the fancy. Don't try to overdo it. Oh, theoretically, it all makes a ton of sense. Well, it makes a ton of sense until the estimation error washes out everything you got from that improved theoretical performance. Top 5 does really well, but what's the broader idea here? Again, with low sample sizes, relatively simple heuristics outperform very complex methods. Okay, so it's not always going to be that we want to kind of build all the theory and do all of this and let's throw in some machine learning and everything else. But you really want to think about simplifying the approaches rather than making them more complex, unless you have a really high amount of data. And I'm going to pass it on over to Yael, who's going to kind of continue the story, but also talk about what I've looked at here is forecasting one quantity. What about if you're really interested in getting the interval forecast right?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for Jason for setting me up for, now that you guys understand the principles of simple averaging and the power of simple averaging, when we talk about point forecasts, it will be a natural way for me to continue and say, well, in many instances, we don't only forecast or predict.
Yes, it gets broadcast.
Okay, I'll try not to move. I typically like to move while I talk. In many cases, we're not just asking or using our models to come up with a single point estimate of one best guess for the future. In many instances, we're going to look at an entire distribution of the future potential outcomes. Okay, so think about the forecast that we saw earlier this morning. In some cases, you're going to produce an entire distribution to convey the uncertainty that you have in your forecast, and not just a single point estimate. So a lot of the averaging and the work that Jason described had to do with how do I combine everybody's best guess for, let's say, the point, the meaning, let's say, of the process. And I'm going to look at what happens if I can ask my experts, all the different individuals that I'm pooling, all the different kind of models that I'm building, if I'm collecting from each one an entire distribution, what do I do then? Can I also apply the principles of averaging and the wisdom of the crowd and the kind of power of combining experts when I'm working with an entire distribution and not a single point? Okay, so that's the transition. And it turns out that, yes, of course, I can combine in very clever ways. And actually, simple heuristics will be very powerful here to produce something that is more, is better calibrated and is more accurate and very useful for decision making. Okay? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that has been done in this field, some by myself, some by Jason and our co-authors and people in our field, in the decision analysis field. And then I'll tell you specifically about one very recent project that I'm involved in. So you're inspired to say, well, there's a whole bunch of literature out there on combining probabilities and interval forecasts. And if you want more information, we can talk about it after the talk. There's too much there for me to cover in one talk. So what's interesting is that if it turns out that if I asked a bunch, if I collected from models or from experts, I'm going to use those interchangeably, if I collect a bunch of forecasts and everybody gives me a whole probability distribution, people give me an entire distribution to convey what they believe is the uncertainty in the future, and I average those using a simple average, it turns out, and this is a result that Hora proved in 2004, it turns out that that prediction, that is an average of other predictions, is going to be underconfident. And what do I mean by that? It's going to be spread out too wide. It's going to be not as concise or as precise as I would want it to be, because I'm taking a bunch of predictions and I'm averaging them out. And so just that observation alone has led to a whole line of papers that say, well, maybe we can do something better to try and correct for this underconfidence. Okay, this tendency, while we as individuals might each be overconfident, when we're combined, we turn out to be something that is too spread out, too underconfident. And so, following on Hora's basic insight, together with Bob Winkler, Casey Vicentel, Victor Jose at Georgetown, and a bunch of other co-authors, we set on a bunch of missions to try and find easy, simple rules that are not dissimilar to the averaging idea to try and correct for this underconfidence problem. Let me give you one solution, because there's a lot written here on the slide. I'll come back to that in a moment. But here's a simple solution that is so subtle, but yet actually pretty powerful, that is a cool idea for you guys to kind of think about for a while. If I collect a bunch of forecasts, so the two dotted lines on the outside of a thicker line in the middle, can you guys see that in the back? So the two dotted lines, or the thick kind of, thick dotted lines, are two probabilities. Imagine those are two experts that gave me their probability distribution. They look pretty similar, but they're different, obviously, in their orientation. If I average these horizontally versus vertically, meaning if I average the quantiles versus averaging the probabilities, so these are the probabilities, these are like vertical lines, those are my horizontal lines, I'm averaging the quantiles, it makes a difference. It produces a different average, and that combined forecast has different properties. It turns out that averaging quantiles actually means that I end up with a narrower distribution, a less underconfident or more precise distribution versus averaging probabilities. So just a simple idea is, do I average the p's or do I average the inverse of that? Makes a difference. And you can use the different averaging mechanisms, very simple, very easy to use. You actually don't need any history in this case. You're just playing around with averaging, and you can benefit from doing a different type of averaging. A similar kind of solution that we show in a different paper is that you can actually trim. So this goes back a little bit to the top 5 idea, inspired by the top 5 idea and point estimates. What we did here is we said, well, instead of averaging all the probabilities, why don't I trim some of these experts? And I can trim in different ways. If everybody is very wide and spread out, and I want to get rid of some of the underconfidence in my pool, I can actually trim on the outside. I can take distributions that are extremes and I can trim them out and only average folks in the middle. On the flip side, there are very specific instances, and this relates then back again to stuff that Jason spoke of. If I do collect probability forecasts from my experts and everybody's in agreement and there's too much common overlap between them, then I might actually at the extreme end up with something too narrow. These are extreme cases, but I could end up with stuff too narrow. And this tool of trimming allows me to do something that we coined interior trimming, where I actually remove forecasts from the inside. And then I'm left with stuff on the outside. So that's the picture on the far end there on the right, where I'm trimming the prediction. Here I have 5 experts that I'm averaging over. You can see the 5 probability, the CDS of 5 experts. I can do my exterior trimming where I'm only trimming the 3 inside, and I can do interior trimming where I'm only trimming the 2 on the outside. And the average that I'm left with has different properties. It's fundamentally different. In one case, I can shrink things, I can end up with something narrower, and in one case, I can end up with something wider. And this mechanism, a really simple tool, allows me to derive different shapes depending on what I'm hoping to correct for. If there's too much overlap or there's not enough overlap, I can control that with my different heuristics and my tools. So similar to these ideas, there's a bunch of other papers that have been written on simple kind of tools and different mechanisms that can be used for averaging probability distributions. And so just to kind of be respectful of time, I'm going to give you a short example of how we kind of tested these concepts. This is using data that was collected as part of the M4 competition. I don't know if you know, but again, in this kind of world of forecasting that is more context agnostic, so not necessarily a specific domain like you are all here to talk about one specific type of forecasting. It seems from the outside like one specific kind of forecasting. There's many different forecasts. But folks who deal with forecasting, decision analysts like ourselves, are context agnostic. We can talk about ecological forecasting, but we can talk about economic quantities, we can talk about business quantities, we can talk about many different quantities. And the M4 competition is the 4th iteration of a forecasting competition in which the community tries to test their forecasting methods and see how well they can come up with predictions, out of sample predictions, all out of sample. This is a recent competition that just completed in 2008. And here there were 100,000 different time series that were being forecast, and folks submitted their models, which were statistical models and machine learning models. And they submitted a point estimate, their best guess for the predictions of this time series, but they also submitted intervals. They submitted basically 95% interval ranges, so they're 2.5 quantile and they're 97.5 quantile. And what we did is we wanted to say, how good are these intervals that they submitted, and can we do better than them by averaging all of the submissions? So about 50 teams competed, and there was a big conference, and a winner was declared. It was from industry. Uber put in the winning model. These are some ideas to give you about the different time series that were part of this 100,000 data set of time series, the whole competition. So they're from different daily, hourly, different domains, different lengths of horizon. And we looked at how good averaging their intervals would do versus the median versus different types of trimming, like I just kind of showed you. We wanted to test how well those would perform. And we measured, there were 2 things that got measured. We measured something called the mean scale interval score. That's kind of some kind of measure of accuracy of the interval. And we also measured calibration, how well their intervals expressed their 95th confidence level. So were they underconfident or overconfident? Because if the realizations hit too often in the middle, okay, so if the realizations hit more than 95% of the time in the middle, that would be an underconfident distribution or underconfidence interval. But if the realizations hit only, let's say, 80% of the time within their interval, then they're underconfident, then they're overconfident, they're too narrow. And so looking at the different models, so this is the table, there's a lot of numbers here, I don't expect you guys to see those numbers, but things to note, these are the submissions that were made to the competition. Hybrid models, meaning there were machine learning models being submitted, so folks use very sophisticated machine learning models these days, XGBoost, random forest, and all these different techniques, versus statistical models being submitted. One observation is hybrid models work best. A combination of machine learning and statistical models, putting those together in one framework work best and produce most accurate forecasts, both in terms of the score and in terms of the calibration. Another thing to really, that was important to the community and that might interest you all in this room is that machine learning models did not do very well. Meaning that compared to simple, naive mechanisms, machine learning models performed worse and were not as successful as statistical models. And I'll end with what we kind of showed, and I'll kind of pause there and hopefully go back to some items that you find interesting during the panel discussion. What we were able to show is that using our mechanisms of simple heuristics that don't rely on any historical performance, we can use, in this case, the median and the interior trimming can improve substantially the performance of these intervals. I can combine the different models into these simple averages and come up with forecasts that would perform much better. Okay? And so that was our observation, and we can find that in a working paper of ours. And so really we wanted to kind of summarize both of the parts of the talk to say simple averages, or averaging in general works. So combining different models, different forecasts into one works and works really well. Simple averages often outperform more sophisticated techniques. And when you do use simple averages, even there is a lot of, there's a lot of flavor there. There's many different variations of averaging that you can use. And while they're simple and they don't rely on historical data, you can be quite creative and improve your forecasts. So thank you very much.